air is thick with dust and the noise is deafening. You're pinned down and the fear would set in if it wasn't for your fellow soldiers standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. There's debris and detritus all over the place, but the day isn't lost yet. Hi, my name's Maddie, and today we're making some ruined factory terrain. This will be the final part of a terrain set that I actually started making a while ago. Perfect for bolt action, 40k, or any game that needs a ruined industrial setting. I'm only going to be using really common basic items, and it's about a day's worth of work, glued fingers and paint on my shirt. But first, let's get to planning. I know the basic silhouette I want for the factory ruin. I want a large front facade with the doorway wide enough for a heavy tank in bolt action. It will be the centerpiece of this terrain, so I want it to be 3 stories tall. I want the sides to be 2 ruined walls, like just barely holding up the front. I grabbed one of the existing terrain pieces to measure the height and decided it needed to be 3 stories and a roof, so it's as impressive as can be. I also used a German Panther from Bolt Action to decide on my doorway width. I quickly sketched out a basic idea of the sides and the shape of the baseboard, and then it got to work. Like most wargaming scratch builds, I started with foam core, pencil and a ruler, roughing out the shape of the front wall with the roof and the wide doorway. Excess bits of foam core were drafted into service for the sides, which I made using inches, so they matched most game systems' movement measurements. The shape is asymmetrical to give it some visual interest and hopefully sell a bit of the realism of a destroyed building. And now the fun part. Using my box cutter, I shaved off bits of the paper that's on the outside of the foam core. But now with the raw foam exposed, I have somewhere to create a bricked texture. I shaved off the paper so that the leftover looks like plaster that had been violently torn off in places to expose the brick underneath. My brick pattern was made using a pencil with an eraser on the end. I dug out the eraser and using pliers, I reshaped the thin metal housing that surrounded it. With this freshly born brick stamp, I happily punched away, making sure I kept the bricks level to the ground and overlapping them like you see in the real world when they lay bricks. This kept them looking the part. I started gluing the sides and the front together by cutting little channels in the front of the building so I could make it flush and hopefully keep the corners neat with like a paper to paper seam. I failed. My cuts were messy and I got impatient waiting for the glue to dry. Off camera, I just ripped it apart and moving on, gave it a sealing coat of like black acrylic paint, PVA glue and water. It was a ruined building, so get messy, no finesse needed. The terrain piece needed a base, so some 3mm MDF and a box cutter were employed. I followed the shape of my ruin and hacked away. The only extra thing I did was bevel the edges. I don't like round or square bases. I prefer my terrain bases to follow the outline of the building, kind of like an amoeba. I put some black paint, burnt umber, just cheap acrylic, PVA glue, fine sand and water in a tub, and then I just slopped it all over the MDF. The sand will be a useful asset later. After all my messy PVA and glue work had dried, I finally re-glued the structure together and then stuck it onto the base. I'm using tacky glue, which is great for fast work, and it loves getting all over my fingers. I now have a big black thing. So I got my airbrush out and I went to town. I have to match the work I'd already done on the other parts of the set. They were done in a rush the day before a tournament, so I'm recoating the PVA bits with a grey primer like the others were. It's a great colour itself for this kind of plaster or concrete work. I used some paper to try and avoid the base as much as possible with the airbrush. For the bricks, I base coated them using Vallejo Red from the Model Air range. This is the colour I use on the original terrain, but we'll be sprucing it up soon. But before sprucing it up though, we need to get grungy. I use a combination of dark khaki green and dark grey Vallejo washes to add greasy streaks down the plaster sections of the building. I run my brush vertically and working over any pooled patches of the washes until it looks like the clouds had just rained muddy oil all over the walls. Next is the detritus. I started by deciding I want 3 elements: brick, broken wood planks, and twisted metal. Bricks were cut from thin strips of foam and then just stirred through a PVA glue, red ochre, cheap acrylic, and sand mix. Planks were just thin craft sticks, paddle pop sticks, coffee stirrers, or however you describe them. They were cut to size and drowned in a wash of Vallejo dark grey, thinned with water. Twisted metal used to live life as the Microsoft paperclip helper guy until I murdered a whole village of them and twisted their corpses into bendy shapes. I made little pools of tacky glue and started dumping this little combination down, starting with bricks and then building up shapes with the planks, metal, and other bricks. I kept to corners and areas where there were exposed brick in the wall, also making sure any windows and doors remain unobstructed so your minis can still get to them and shoot through them and whatnot. After this dried, I grabbed my sand again and stirred in some pigments, Vallejo European dirt, and then made another PVA mix, but this time just with PVA and water. I syringed this glue mix around the piles of debris and poured the sand over, tapping off the excess to be used again. This made a kind of pile of broken bits and sand, as if it had been pushed aside as soldiers walked around and made little paths for themselves. The final step was the step that all wargaming terrain must go through if it thinks it's going to call itself terrain: dry brushing. I used the cheap red ochre acrylic from the brick mix to dry brush the brick walls to connect the two surfaces visually. Vallejo Desert Yellow was then dry brushed over the piles of sand around the detritus and onto the base itself. This is where the sand we mixed into the PVA and paint at the beginning really shines. It gives little bits for the dry brush to hit and makes the ground 3D. When applying the mix earlier, I also slopped the leftover into the space where the big doorway would be, because I knew it would need extra texture. Okay. And here they all are. This main piece was done within a day, with the glue only needing a small amount of drying time. Most of these materials are fairly common and you probably already have them already. It was quick, it was messy, but I love every bit of this ruined terrain. It makes a nice change from the Gothic architecture, French countryside, or crumbling medieval castle that you normally see on the tabletop. So here are some pretty images of the terrain set, and if you liked what I did here, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you can catch the next video. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down and tell me why it was crap in the comments. See ya.